Hate. It's nothing new. Across the pages of history, people have expressed their hatred for the minorities in many ways. Some leaders expressed such hate that they started secret clubs to annihilate their victims. Others went for the more generally destructive approach and started mass genocides wiping off millions at a time. Later on in history, we had settled most of our differences. We labeled these actions as hate crimes and made them prosecuted by law. What we didn't outlaw was hate speech. This is mostly because if we were to make a law actually banning hate speech, we would be contradicting our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. So what is the difference between hate speech and free speech?
It's a way that people express themselves. You know, the Constitution does allow you freedom of speech. However, if you talk about, but if that hate speech potentially leads to a hate crime, I think it should be also in the equation of hate crime.
Well, I think hate speech and hate crimes are different animals. You know, hate speech is an awful thing, but again, people do have the freedom based on the First Amendment to say a lot of hateful things and a lot of really inappropriate things. And usually the best argument against hate speech is to essentially oppose it.
Well, I don't think there should be any restriction on speech. And I don't like the term hate speech. You know, there's rude behavior, there's socially unacceptable behavior. If you don't like the environment you're standing in and you don't like what's being said, ignore it. The quickest way to shut someone up is to not pay any attention to them.
The recruiting is tricky. It depends on what they're doing in recruiting. If they're individually buttonholing people, it may be a little bit different, especially if someone tells them to go away, and especially if it's a minor. But as far as letting them spread literature, again, we think that in the First Amendment and courts have held that for centuries now, is that let's go ahead and let all the information out there. People can advocate whatever they want. That means that the Ku Klux Klan can march in the city of Indianapolis, which they have. Nazis can march in Skokie, Illinois, which they have. That's offensive, and it's loathsome, and people have engaged in counter demonstrations. It's made a lot of us think a little bit more about what we really believe.
Freedom of speech to speak, yes, but if it incites violence and promotes destruction or murder, I think that this is where it should be put to a stop. Because then it creates hatred, and it can create what Hitler did. I mean, he originally started it as a propaganda, and his speeches were inciting his followers to murder. And ultimately, that was the first step.
Bruce Fine, in Tuesday's Washington Times, you wrote the following: "The United States should criminalize a root cause of terrorism, hate speech, teaching that indiscriminate murders are morally justified to further a crazed religious, racial, ethnic, or political cause. Europe has been more perspicacious than the United States on that score. The splenetic epithets heard in many madrasas or mosques or taught in many Islamic textbooks are exemplary of the evil."
And to classify something as a hate crime or hate speech, I'm sorry, murder's murder. There was obvious intent. You know, rape is rape. It's to add an extra syllable and call it hate. Of course it's motivated by hate. Why else would anyone behave in that fashion?
It's different from a hate crime in which someone is actually hurt or injured. I'm not in support of hate speech in any way, but again, I'd be wary of who's going to define what is hate speech, and where's the government going to get involved in saying what you can say and what you can't say.
Hate speeches, if they go and begins to be a segue to a hate crime, it is an act of terrorism. The discussion that's happened in regards to hate crimes is, what does it really mean? But the key to point is the word terrorism is very crucial when we talk about hate crimes, because anyone can do something against someone because they're short, because they're tall, because they live in a certain part of town. But it's not just dealing with that individual, that male, female, gay, lesbian, gender, anything like that. It deals with not just that individual, but it deals with what is the results of hitting that whole segment of the population.
We think, though, it's important that everyone has the right to express their views, because if we start making a decision that no, these particular neo-Nazi groups, they're not allowed to distribute their literature, the next time it may be Republicans saying Democrats can't distribute their literature. Someone else, if we start defining what we think should be an allowable speech that's not personally threatening to someone, then that's against the First Amendment, it's against the principles of what the country's about.
I think that you can even say to use the law against the people who might have done something wrong, but to advocate murder is extremely dangerous, because it will give an excuse to people to carry it out. All these terrible things happen, first of all, with taking advantage of the freedom of speech.
So I think we have to be very careful whenever we start talking about restricting the freedom of speech. It's one of the first couple of amendments for a reason. It's because in the development of the world and in the development of the United States, it was seen as a paramount right that you would have the right to take your grievances before your government.
This is America, and America you have rights in America, okay? And the freedom of speech is very crucial. The freedom of education, to have education is crucial. But we have to educate individuals to what hate speeches would do.
Hate speech is to be decried, it's to be opposed, but I'd be careful about too much regulation that defines hate speech and believing that hate speech is going to lead, just because somebody says something, means it's going to lead them to doing a terrorist act.
You do not have the right, as a freedom of speech, to advocate murder of other people. That is no longer freedom of speech. You can express your opinion about not liking other people, criticizing other people, but I believe that murder should not be a freedom of speech expressed verbally.
Let them gather. Let them talk about what they want to do. But you know what I think people should do? I think the media should stay away. Because if they don't have an audience outside of who's there, the 25 or 30 people, then their comments, their work, their demonstration does not get out to the public. So, for someone to rally, to gather, that's their right.
No, I think that these are good questions, and it's a good issue. It's a difficult issue because you do want to have this balance between protecting the freedom of speech that makes this country the unique characteristic that we have. At the same time, we don't ever want to allow, and the ICLU will never support a situation where an individual is threatened, an individual is personally put into some kind of jeopardy or harm, because that's not freedom of speech. The Constitution does not protect our right to threaten someone else or to put them in a scared situation.
The original intent of freedom of speech, what I think, is to criticize people in power and point out what they are doing wrong. But I don't think it was intended to murder.
But I think if we as a society as a whole feel that we don't want that, we should just ignore that behavior of that nature. And if we ignore that behavior and no one knows what they're doing, no one knows what happened, no one knows what was said, guess what? They are talking to the people that have light minds, and it won't go out to other individuals.